So the topic of this video will be the EVGA Z790 Classified motherboard. I first came across this motherboard model back in early December of last year at the EVGA Overclocking event that was held in Taipei, Taiwan. The motherboard model looked pretty interesting, and after the event I requested a sample from the EVGA BIOS team, and I finally received this motherboard during this January. So let's take a very extensive look at the motherboard itself, like see what features does it come with, and on the second video I will do the actual overclocking tests, like see how well the motherboard can overclock the CPU, but especially the memory. The biggest question mark being like how high can it overclock 4 individual memory DIMMs, as that is pretty much the main difference between the two motherboard models. Now, on this generation, the Classified could actually be the more interesting motherboard option from EVGA. They managed to implement many of the features that were unique to the dark and the dark Kimpin motherboards only to the Classified. First and foremost, this is the first Classified model from EVGA that has the rotated socket present on the motherboard. So now we have all of the power connectors at the same location. So we have this very nice cutout on the motherboard's PCB, and all of the power connectors are at the same spot pretty much. So we have the motherboard 24-pin power connector over here, both of the CPU EPS 8-pin power connectors, and this one front panel USB 3.0 connector. Most of the features are actually the same on both of the motherboard models, and this time around the price difference is actually lower than before. So it's only like $100 or euro difference between the Classified and the dark Kimpin. So at the EVGA official web store, the dark Kimpin is listed at $800 and the Classified goes for $700. I would assume similar pricing when the motherboard models get listed at the EU EVGA web store eventually. I still don't know when will they be listed at the EU store. I think Jacob actually mentioned on his Twitter page that they should arrive at the European market very, very soon. But that has been one of the main issues for EVGA, that the European market doesn't really keep up with the American market in terms of availability. So it would be a good thing to see a bit better availability on the European market for these EVGA motherboards. And I don't have like exact information, does the price differ that much compared to the official EVGA web store and some like other PC retailers, but that's the main information I have at the moment. So the Classified could actually be the better option from the two motherboard models if you are building like just a daily system. So if you are just going to be doing like gaming and workstation use. As Intel hasn't really released any new CPUs to the HEDT market for many years now. I know that they have some new CPUs coming out to the market very, very soon, but at the time of making this video, the 13th gen CPUs are actually the best offering from Intel for any kind of use pretty much. So even for gaming and workstation use. So if you are going to do like video rendering or similar work to that, the 13th gen CPUs are probably the best option from Intel. Obviously, as there aren't higher core count CPUs available from Intel that could match the AMD's offerings in performance, I think most of the workstation users are going for AMD CPUs, but that's something I wanted to mention about these Intel platforms at the time of making this video. So if you don't really need the extreme overclocking oriented features, you could actually just go for the Classified, as I think they are nearly the same or pretty much identical when it comes to ambient cooling performance. By just looking, I think the VRM itself is nearly identical. They had to make some changes at the PCI Express layout as well when they moved the CPU socket closer to the center of the motherboard's PCB, but I think they should still have like 90 amp power stages from Intersil. But I don't really want to start looking at the real aspects or the real like component models on the VRM area. I hope Buildsource could actually cover the VRM structure of these motherboards at some point, but they should still be pretty much identical. So if you have, let's say, a 1300K that can pass 5.8 GHz in Cinebench R20 on water cooling at like 1.35 volts, you can be absolutely certain that it can reach that very same clock speed also on the classified. So the only difference is actually on the memory. As the dark Kimpin has only 2 memory slots, so single slot per channel design, it can obviously go a bit higher, especially on LN2 overclocking situations, but I'm actually quite sure the classified could actually reach pretty high frequencies as well. The official value is up to DDR5 8000 on the dark Kimpin and up to 7800 on the classified, and that's probably with just 2 memory sticks. The biggest question mark will be how high can it overclock, let's say like 4 individual Hynix A die memory sticks. The capacities can go much higher on the classified as you have 4 memory slots available. So on the classified you can run memories from 64 gigabytes up to 128 gigabytes if you use dual rank memory sticks. I think dual rank is still quite rare on DDR5. At least I haven't seen anyone using dual rank sticks. I actually thought about buying some myself. I really would like to test like dual rank Hynix A die, like see how high could they be overclocked and what kind of performance difference would they have compared to the very best single rank Hynix A die sticks. Because in effect, dual rank sticks should be better performing as long as the performance figures are nearly the same. So that means frequency and the latency values. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. So if we just go through these main features very briefly, the top part of the PCB is pretty much the same. So we have just one Pro-bit voltage measurement point over here, which you can use to measure all of the different voltages by using a digital multimeter. On this generation, they only have a single Pro-bit header available, but you don't really need to be able to measure all of those different like sub voltages with a multimeter. That's not really necessary. So just one Pro-bit connector over here is more than enough if you ask me. We have 4 RGB headers over here at the same location, just like on the dark Kimpin, and I think it's a pretty good thing from EVGA. So you can actually have pretty tidy cable management when all of the RGB headers are at the same location. We have 2 4-pin fan headers over here, and the other one is actually labeled as a pump header, so it probably has just higher current output compared to normal fan headers. I think it should be like 3 amps. So just make sure when you plug all of your like fan connectors and possible like water cooling pumps, be sure which headers you use if you want to use the maximum amount of power on your water cooling pump, for example. We have the debug LED at the same location, just like the power and reset buttons, just like on the dark Kimpin. The debug LED obviously shows you all of the debug code, so if you face some issues like memory related issues and so on, but this obviously works as a monitoring device as well. So you can actually monitor many of the voltages at the hardware level by using this device, or something like CPU die temperature and so on. I usually use CPU PWM temperature as the option for the OLED display. When I run these motherboards on LN2, I like to follow what kind of VRM area temperatures I'm getting, like see is my heater plate working correctly behind the motherboard, because the VRM area is actually the most prone to condensation issues. If you don't have ample amount of heat behind the motherboard, the VRM area itself could start building like snow and ice, and if you suddenly apply a lot of like load on your CPU, the VRM obviously starts to get warmer, and that could melt all of the ice and snow and cause a lot of condensation issues. So that's something I usually like to use. You can of course use the CPU die temperature on ambient cooling, so that usually gives you the same reading as your hottest core. So it's actually pretty nice feature on the EVGA motherboards. I think EVGA is the only motherboard vendor that has offered such a device already on the motherboard PCB. I cannot see a PCI Express or M.2 disable switch like on the dark Kimpin. That's something I would like to see on the classified as well. So if you have, let's say, like 2 cards installed in SLI with custom water cooling, or if you have multiple M.2 devices installed, if one of them starts to give you issues, you can quickly troubleshoot which one of them is giving you issues by using those dip switches. We don't sadly have it present on the classified, so that's something EVGA could consider on the future classifieds if they still keep up with the motherboard scene, and I really hope they still keep on producing these motherboards because they are awesome, as we had the EVGA and NVIDIA drama during this last autumn pretty much. So EVGA stopped making graphics cards, but I really hope they still keep on going with these awesome motherboards. This one over here, many people have been asking about it. That's the BIOS update port. So it's pretty much the same thing as BIOS flashback on Asus motherboards. So if you accidentally corrupt any of the three BIOSes that are present on the motherboard, you can actually recover that corrupted BIOS by using an empty USB stick on this USB port and just press the BIOS update button at the rear I/O, and you can get that corrupted BIOS back up and running by using that BIOS update function over there. The only annoying thing about this USB port that has been present on all of the dark and dark Kimpin generations, for example, is that it's very picky on the USB stick you may want to use on that port. For me, I've had the best success with very old, like USB 2.0 sticks. So please be aware if you get some very random error codes on the OLED display when you try to do the BIOS update thing. It's probably just that the motherboard is very picky on the USB stick you are going to use. And I forgot to mention the safe boot button at the top right corner of the motherboard's PCB. So it's right next to the OLED display and the power and reset buttons. So it's very good if you dial in some settings which fail to post. Just hit that button over there and it will load your previous settings. I really like that one actually. They don't have a clear CMOS button present on the motherboard's PCB on this board. So if you want to clear the CMOS, the only available button for that function is at the rear I/O. Now, there's actually a major difference in the SATA area on this motherboard compared to the dark Kimpin. Both of the motherboards have 8 SATA ports, but the main difference is that on the Classified, all of these 8 SATA ports over here are wired directly to the Z790 chipset. On the dark Kimpin, 6 of the 8 ports are wired directly to the Z790 chipset, and 2 of them are wired through a third-party ASMedia SATA controller. The only reason for that is to offer extra flexibility on operating system support. EVGA was actually the first Z390 motherboard manufacturer that managed to boot Windows XP successfully, and that was a very interesting thing for EVGA back in 2018. Since the launch of the Intel's Z170, so the Skylake platform, it has been very difficult to install older operating systems than Windows 8, but especially older operating systems than Windows 7. These newer generation motherboards, they don't have the AHCI support for very old operating systems like Windows XP, for example. So you cannot really boot Windows XP right out of the box on these new generations from Intel. If you try to boot, let's say, Windows XP, you will just get a blue screen of death error code. So that's why the ASMedia SATA controller was implemented on the first Z390 dark motherboard model, because those very old ASMedia controllers still have the very old AHCI drivers for the older operating systems. That was the main solution we used to be able to boot, let's say, like Windows XP or Server 2003 on the dark and the dark Kimpin motherboards. But since Z490 or Z590, the Asus guys actually managed to modify the Intel AHCI drivers as well as the USB drivers. I actually noted this when I made my latest Windows XP installation guide for the Z490 dark Kimpin. You can actually use modified Intel drivers, so you can actually get the Intel USB ports working at the rear I/O, and they actually have modified Intel AHCI drivers now for these newer generations, so you don't necessarily even need ASMedia SATA ports present on the motherboard to be able to boot old operating systems like Windows XP or Server 2003 or Windows Vista. I'm pretty sure you could boot even Windows XP on the Classified, as at least on the Asus ROG Apex thread at hardwarebot.org, they do have the modified AHCI files for the Intel ports anyways. But I still like that they have the ASMedia SATA controller present on the dark Kimpin, because it at least gives you more flexibility if you face any kind of issues. That's pretty much like an extreme overclocking oriented feature anyway, so that's one of the main things you pay for in the extra $100 price tag when you go for the dark kimpin. So as a daily user, you don't really need that kind of features present on the Classified, so that's pretty much the reason why it wasn't implemented on the Classified anyways. But it's something I really wanted to mention anyways, as this is my channel and most of you guys are probably interested in that kind of stuff. So the Classified also has 3 individual BIOS chips. All of them are SMD, so they aren't removable, so they are located on the bottom right corner of the motherboard's PCB over here, and you control which of the BIOS chips is being used with this switch over here. Otherwise, the bottom part of the motherboard's PCB looks pretty much the same. Many of the fan connectors over here are rotated at 90 degrees to provide you better cable management. And as I already said, the PCI Express layout is a little bit different on this motherboard model when they managed to rotate the socket 90 degrees and they had to push the whole socket area more downwards, and that also affected the PCI Express layout. So we still have 2 full-length X16 PCI Express slots over here with same distance between the 2 main X16 slots like on the dark kimpin. We have this one X4 slot over here that's wired directly to the chipset, but there's actually a pretty nice difference between the Classified and the dark kimpin, which only impacts the more extreme enthusiasts anyways. There has been a very sad thing on the dark and the dark kimpin motherboards since Z490, that the BIOS battery has been located right after the PCI Express X4 slot. So on the dark kimpin, for example, you cannot install a full-length X16 low-end video card on the X4 slot if you have a BIOS battery installed on the motherboard. It will just hit the other end of the golden contact pads of the graphics card. So if you want to install a full-length X16 device on the X4 slot on the dark kimpin, you actually have to remove the BIOS battery first, and it's quite annoying. But that's not the case on the Classified, as the BIOS battery is located in a different place. But again, that's more or less an extreme overclocking oriented feature. You don't really need X16 device in the X4 slot. That's only for some very rare like use cases when you want to minimize the stress on your CPU. So for example, if you are going for 9 GHz validation on the CPU with liquid helium, or for maximum memory validation, that's a use case where you would probably want to minimize the load on the CPU and use a graphics card for video output on the chipset X4 slot over here. Now, as the second full-length X16 slot is very close to the bottom edge of the motherboard's PCB, you should take this into account if you want to run, let's say, 2 cards in SLI, like 2 3090s or 3090 Ti's in SLI. Make sure your computer case you are going for can mount or can fit a second card over here with its cooling solution. There are some computer cases that have some parts immediately after the bottom edge of the motherboard's PCB that could get in the way. So just make sure your computer case will fit this motherboard fine, and it can fit a second card over here with its cooling solution if you are going for an SLI system. Of course, now with the 40 series of graphics card, SLI is getting quite obsolete anyways. But you can still do it with the 3090 and 3090 Ti's, for example. And that same thing applies to this supplementary 6-pin power connector that's actually still present on both motherboard models. You don't really need this, even if you run 2 3090s or 3090 Ti's in SLI. These modern generations from NVIDIA, they don't really draw that much power from the PCI Express slot anyways. But that's still something you can install if you want to be like absolutely safe. But you don't need to plug this in if you use just a single graphics card, like single 3090 Ti or single 4090. It's just there for like extra safety purposes, but it's very obsolete nowadays. Now there's a small difference in the M.2 ports compared to the dark kimpin. There are 3 M.2 slots available on the Classified, just like on the dark kimpin, but the length is actually a bit different. So these should be 2280 M.2 ports, And on the dark kimpin they have the longest option available, so that means 22 times 110. So you can install the longest available M.2 drives on the dark kimpin, but if you ask me, the 22 110 drives, they are actually pretty rare. I have never used one myself. I've only used these 2280 M.2 drives. But just take that into account if you are selecting M.2 devices for your classified motherboard. So you cannot install 22 times 110 M.2 devices on the classified model. But yeah, so that's pretty much it, I guess. Now the last thing will be the rear I/O. There's only a very minor difference at the rear I/O compared to the dark kimpin. So we have both the CMOS clear button as well as the BIOS update button over here. We have the Wi-Fi antennas. We have 8 USB ports over here, but on the classified we actually have 2 USB-C ports compared to just 1 on the dark kimpin, but we are lacking a PS2 combo port, which is a bit sad thing from EVGA. There are lots of gamers out there who still use a PS2 keyboard, so they definitely should have a PS2 combo port above either of these USB ports over here. Otherwise they have just a dual Ethernet option available, just like on the dark kimpin and your 7.1 audio. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. I really look forward to seeing how well this board can overclock the memory. I have 4 very high-end Hynix 8i sticks ready to be overclocked on the classified board. So pre-tested Hynix 8i from Taobao in China. All of those 4 sticks can do DDR5 8000 and beyond on air cooling. So I really would like to see 4 DIMMs at DDR5 8000 and beyond. EVGA actually went pretty nuts with the PCB layer count on these motherboard offerings on this generation. So the dark kimpin was upgraded to 14 layers and the classified has a 12 layer PCB. So I think EVGA has the highest layer count on the PCB on their motherboard models compared to other vendors, I think. So that should actually help with the memory overclocking. That's probably the only reason that really improved the memory overclocking on the Z790 dark kimpin compared to the Z690 dark kimpin. But that's something I have to test out myself. So yeah, what do you think about the classified? Drop a comment down below this video, and which of the motherboard models would you consider buying? But again, this is my honest opinion. If you are just going to be building, let's say, a daily oriented system, so you are going to be just gaming or doing some video rendering, etc., you should probably consider the classified instead of the dark kimpin. My actual overclocking test will conclude that part about the motherboard model, like is the classified actually behind the dark kimpin on ambient cooling performance when it comes to memory, and by how much. Like if the dark kimpin could do 8200, could the classified do 8000 or even 8200 with just 2 DIMMs? And with 4 DIMMs, what would be the highest like realistic memory frequency we could achieve? I would like to test 4 times 32 gigabytes, so 128 gigabytes of memory, but currently I cannot really do it. I might actually buy some dual rank Hynix 8i from China again, but that will be for the next time. So pretty interesting design from EVGA. So if you like to see this video about the EVGA Z790 Classified, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Again, drop a comment down below this video what you think about these motherboard models, and do you hope that EVGA will keep on with their motherboard products in the future as well? But yeah, thanks for watching one of my videos once again, and I will see you on the next one.